Dad said, "You always make this family look smaller." That same night, I lost my key to my parents' house, the $4,280 I had put on my credit card for their 40th anniversary dinner, and the last place I still let myself call home when things got hard. Nobody said a word for me. What my parents did not know was that someone else had heard everything from just outside the kitchen. 6 weeks later, the truth came out in front of the whole family. Have you ever sat at a family table and felt your own name turn into something people only used when they needed a favor? The dining room looked polished in the way my mother loved. White tablecloth, silver candle holders, cream roses in low bowls. The framed studio portrait from their anniversary photo session stood on the hutch beside the china cabinet. In the picture, my parents were seated in front. Caroline stood behind my mother with one hand on her shoulder, and there was no version of it with me in the frame. I noticed that before anyone said hello. I had been there since 8 that morning. I picked up the flowers, confirmed the catering trays, steamed my mother's dress, and paid the bakery balance when my father told me his card was tied up for the week. I also covered the extra rental chairs after Caroline said she had forgotten my Aunt June was bringing Randall and his wife. It all went onto my card because somebody had to do it, and in my family, that usually meant me. Carolyn arrived at 6:30 in a pale blue suit with her husband Greg and their daughters, both girls carrying tissue-wrapped gifts they had probably chosen that afternoon. My mother's face changed the second she saw them. Softer, brighter. The version of her that only came out when Caroline entered a room. "Doesn't she look beautiful?" my mother said to nobody in particular. My father took Greg's arm and asked about the store before he asked me whether the coffee had been set up. That was normal too. Caroline had always been the daughter who made my parents look successful. She had a husband who sold commercial real estate, a tidy house in a gated subdivision, and a home decor boutique my father liked to describe as a real family legacy in the making, even though half the time it sounded one slow month away from trouble. I was 52, divorced, and working contract bookkeeping jobs after the print shop I managed closed 3 years earlier. I paid my rent, I paid my bills, I kept going. In my father's eyes, that only counted as stability if it came with better packaging. Dinner started loud and easy for everyone else. My Uncle Ray told the same golf story twice. Pastor Williams laughed before the punchline, the way he always did. My mother kept touching the pearls at her throat. I moved between the kitchen and the table with casserole dishes, serving spoons, and a pitcher of iced tea. My place setting was at the far end, nearest the swinging kitchen door, not beside my parents, not even beside Aunt June. The seat beside my mother had gone to Caroline, of course. The seat beside my father had gone to Greg. Across from them sat the girls, then the pastor, then my uncle and aunt. By the time I sat down, the room had already arranged itself into the version of the family my parents preferred. I told myself not to care. I cared anyway. Halfway through dinner, my father stood to make a toast. He thanked everyone for coming. He thanked the church for keeping good values alive. He thanked Caroline for helping my mother with the centerpieces, which was not true. Then he lifted his glass a little higher. "To 40 years, he said. "To loyalty. To family who know how to carry the name well." He looked straight at Caroline when he said it. Everybody understood. Then his eyes moved to me. "And to those who at least try not to make things harder than they already are." A few people smiled too carefully. My mother lowered her eyes and cut another piece of roast chicken as if she had not heard him. Caroline said, "Dad," in that warning voice people use when they want credit for pretending to stop something they actually enjoy. I should have let it go. Instead, I said, "I paid for half of tonight. I don't think that counts as making things harder." The room went still. My father smiled, but only with his mouth. "We can settle that later." My mother said, "Elaine, not tonight." Not tonight meant never in our house. It always had. I remember the clink of silverware after that. I remember the candle flame bending when the air kicked on. I remember Caroline touching my mother's wrist under the table like they were sharing one private understanding, and I was outside both of them. That should have told me enough. It didn't. After cake, I went into the kitchen to gather the receipts from the counter. I had tucked them inside a plain white envelope beside the microwave. Bakery, flowers, rentals, coffee earned deposit, and the yellow carbon copy from the caterer. My rent was due in 3 days. I needed the reimbursement that week. My father came in behind me. My mother followed a second later, already folding a napkin in her hands. I said, as calmly as I could, I need the money by Friday. My father opened the refrigerator, moved a dish of whipped cream aside, and said, Caroline needs help with the girls' tuition payment this month. That has to come first. I looked at him. I paid for this dinner. He closed the refrigerator and leaned back against it. And this is exactly what I mean. You always reduce things. It's a bill, Dad. It's family, I said. It's my money. That was when he gave me the look I had known since I was 12, the one that said I had broken the tone of the room just by insisting on reality. Then he said it. You always make this family look smaller. My mother kept folding the napkin. Nobody came in. Nobody interrupted. He held out his hand and said, Give me your key. I stared at him because I thought I had heard wrong. I still used the side entrance sometimes when I came by early to help my mother with appointments or holiday cooking. I had a key, because for years my father said family should not have to knock. He meant until family cost him something. I'm not taking anything from the house, I said. That isn't the point. My mother finally spoke. Maybe clearer boundaries would help. That was how she did it. She never joined him in the cruelty. She came in after, smoothing the edges so it looked like order instead of rejection. I set my key on the counter beside the white envelope. That was when I saw the shadow through the frosted glass near the pantry door. A man shifted in the hallway. Then, a low throat clear. When I pulled the kitchen door open, Daniel Mercer stood there with a leather folder under his arm and an expression I could not read at first. He was my parents' attorney. He had been around for wills, trust updates, property transfers, things people in my family called paperwork, as if paperwork did not decide who mattered. He had heard enough. I knew it from the way he stepped back. My father came to the door at once and said, too quickly, We're just finishing up in here. Daniel nodded once. Of course. But his eyes moved to the key on the counter, then to the white envelope with my receipts showing through the thin paper. A second later, Caroline walked in for coffee, saw the scene, and stopped. She looked at the key. She looked at me. Then she said, Are we doing this now? In the tired voice of someone burdened by other people's pain. That hurt more than I expected. Because it was so familiar, I left before the final family photo. I walked through the dining room while everyone pretended not to notice my coat in my hand. My place setting had already been cleared. The chair looked cleaner empty. Outside, the night air felt colder than it should have. I sat in my car under the porch light and stared at the front window where I could see my family gathering for the picture without me. Then my phone lit up with a voicemail from Daniel Mercer. His message was short. Elaine, I can't discuss details on voicemail, but do not throw away your receipts. I listened twice. Then I looked back at the house. If your whole family watched you get humiliated and nobody moved, would you ever forget which faces stayed calm? For a few days, nobody called. That was my family's oldest skill. First the injury, then the quiet, then the expectation that I would return to the usual shape of things without anyone having to admit what happened. I spent the first morning after the anniversary at my small kitchen table with the receipts spread beside my checkbook and a cup of coffee gone cold before I remembered to drink it. My apartment sat over a dry cleaner on Maple Street. The pipes knocked inside the wall when the heat came on. The refrigerator buzzed loud enough to hear from the bedroom. I had lived there 2 years and still kept apologizing for it in my own head, mostly because my father had trained me to. The white envelope from the anniversary sat under a magnet on the refrigerator. $4,280. Every time I looked at it, I heard his voice again, smaller. That word had done a lot of work in my family. It made judgment sound practical. 3 days later, my mother mailed me 2 leftover slices of cake in a foil pan with a note that said only, "Thought you might want this." No check, no apology, no mention of the key. I threw the cake away unopened. A week after that, my mother called to ask if I could drive her to a neurology appointment because Caroline had a school event with the girls. My first instinct was to say no. My second was to remember the tremor in my mother's hands getting worse over the past year. I drove her. That was part of the whole structure too. My family relied on the daughter they respected least because she was the one most likely to keep showing up. The clinic parking lot smelled like wet pavement and diesel from the bus stop across the street. Inside, my mother checked in while I held her purse. It slipped open when I set it on the chair. A folded bank statement slid halfway out. I would not have looked if the line of numbers had not caught my eye. Caroline Holloway Education Fund, $4,300. The transfer date was 2 days after the anniversary dinner. The amount was close enough to stop my breathing for a second. I put the paper back exactly where it had been. I said nothing on the drive home. My mother watched the road and said my father had been under pressure lately. Then she said I had always been more independent than Caroline. In my family, independent was never praise. It meant easier to disappoint, easier to use, easier to deny. At home, I put the anniversary receipt envelope into a blue file folder with my tax records and utility bills. Something in me had shifted. I did not yet know the shape of it. I only knew I was suddenly afraid of forgetting exact dates. That same week, Caroline forwarded the anniversary photos to a family email chain. In every picture, she stood close enough to my parents to look inherited. There was one wide shot of the dining table where the place setting nearest the kitchen had been removed before the picture was taken. The empty space looked deliberate. I stared at that photo longer than I should have. Maybe my parents thought they were protecting the version of the family they preferred. I think they were protecting the version that made them feel less guilty. 4 days later, my phone showed 12 missed calls from my father before 9 in the morning. When I finally answered, he did not ask how I was. He said the heating company still had my number on the account from when I handled the service call last winter and wanted me to fix it because he was too busy to sit on hold. I said no. He went quiet for a second, like a machine that had received the wrong coin. Then he said, "Don't be childish." I hung up. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. A week later, Caroline came to my apartment with an orchid from the grocery store and a face arranged into concern. She sat at my table, looked around once at the chipped counters and the drying rack by the sink, and said she was tired of all the tension. I let her talk. She said our father was trying to streamline things with the house and future planning. She said when families got older, responsibility had to go where it would be best managed. Then she said not everybody was equally good at long-term decisions. That was the closest she ever came to saying the truth out loud. I asked, "Are you getting something signed over?" She smoothed the plastic around the orchid pot. "I'm helping." "With what?" "With what needs to be done." I remember how careful her voice was. Not because she felt bad, because she wanted deniability later. Then she made the mistake that told me more than she meant to. She said, "Dad's tired of being treated like an ATM after everything he's done." I looked at her. "He owes me the anniversary money." She gave a tiny shrug. That money was already needed somewhere else. Needed. As if my rent was vanity. As if her daughter's tuition was the only future worth funding. What would you call it when one child gets help and the other gets told to be grateful for survival? After she left, I moved the orchid to the windowsill and pulled my credit report online for the first time in almost a year. I do not know why I did it then. Maybe because too many things were starting to feel arranged behind my back. Maybe because Caroline had said streamline in the tone my father used when he had already decided the outcome. There were 2 things I did not recognize: a hard inquiry from Harbor State Commercial Lending and a mailing address update request from 16 months earlier tied to my old apartment. I called the number on the report and got transferred 3 times before a woman in loan services told me there was a commercial guarantee connected to my file. For a second, I thought I had misheard her. I wrote down the loan number with a pen that left a dent in the paper because my hand was pressing too hard. She could not discuss details over the phone without verification, but she confirmed the borrower name after I gave my information. Holloway Home and Gift. Caroline's store. The room changed around me when I heard that. The hum of the refrigerator got louder. The light above my sink flickered once. The orchid Caroline brought me stood in the window like an insult with leaves. I said, "I never guaranteed anything for her." The woman told me to come in with identification if I believed the record was incorrect. After the call, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time and looked at the anniversary photos on my laptop screen. My parents smiling, Caroline centered, my chair gone. That family image had already been built on substitution. I think I understood that before I understood the rest. That night, Daniel Mercer called again. His voice was careful, He said if any bank contacted me about a matter I did not recognize, I should not speak to my family first. I should gather documents and get independent advice. I asked him why. He paused. Then he said, because timing matters when people start realizing who has heard what. By the time I hung up, the room felt smaller than it had that morning. Not because of my apartment, because I was starting to see how much had been happening in rooms I was never meant to understand. At what point does family stop feeling like belonging and start feeling like a setup? The bank conference room was colder than it needed to be. There was a laminate table, a box of tissues nobody touched, and a paper cup of water sweating onto a loan packet with my name on it. I sat across from a commercial lending officer named Brent Hall and a woman from Fraud Review who wore silver reading glasses on a chain. The pages between us smelled faintly of toner and old files. Brent slid the guarantee across the table. My name was on the first line. The signature at the bottom looked like mine, only from far away. The borrower was Caroline Storr. The amount attached to the revolving credit line was $126,000. I read it 3 times anyway. Some shocks do not land all at once. They move in layers. First confusion, then heat, then a very quiet kind of fear. I said, "This isn't my signature." The fraud officer nodded as if she had expected that. She turned to the next page. Emergency contact, my parents' landline, mailing address, my apartment from 3 years earlier. Attached identification, a photocopy of my driver's license, the same copy I had once left in my parents' study when my father needed insurance paperwork for his knee surgery. That was when the shape of it became clear. This had not happened in one bad afternoon. This had been built, paper by paper, access point by access point. Brent said the original store loan file showed Caroline as borrower, Greg as co-applicant on inventory security, and a guarantee packet delivered later by hand. The packet had been accepted because the forms appeared complete. I asked who delivered it. He said records suggested someone associated with the borrower, but final confirmation would come later with review. The fraud officer asked me to sign an affidavit disputing the guarantee. She asked whether I suspected identity misuse by a relative. I said I suspected unauthorized access to my documents and unauthorized use of my name. Even then, I was careful. Even then, some part of me was still trying not to sound like the kind of daughter my father had always accused me of being. When I got back to my car, I locked the doors before I read the packet again. The number sat there on the page, $126,000. I had spent most of my adult life being treated like the unstable one, the extra one, the daughter who was one misstep away from proving everybody right. But nobody in my family had trusted Caroline with enough reality to stop her from borrowing against everybody else's. For the first time, I did not just feel hurt. I felt awake. I called Daniel Mercer from the parking lot. He asked me not to discuss details over the phone. He said he would meet me at a coffee shop near the highway where no one from my family usually went. He arrived with no briefcase, just a yellow legal pad, and the look of a man who had already decided to stop pretending the situation was ordinary. He said he could not represent me because his firm had represented my parents for years. Then he said he had withdrawn from a trust amendment my father had wanted signed on anniversary night. I asked why. He looked down at the pad once, then back at me. Because I heard enough in your kitchen to understand there were facts being omitted from the instructions I was given. I said nothing. He continued. He said the anniversary night was supposed to include review of a revised family property structure, one that would shift practical control of the house and connected reserve authority toward Caroline for management continuity. He used that phrase first, then gave me the simpler version. My father had wanted Caroline positioned to manage assets before anyone could challenge the pattern already in motion. Before anyone could challenge it, I repeated. His face stayed neutral. Before you could ask for documents. I thought of the key on the kitchen counter, the receipts, the white envelope. My father saying smaller in the same tone he used when criticizing a crooked hem or a weak church choir. Then, at almost the exact center of that conversation, Daniel slid one page toward me. It was an internal note from a prior asset review, not a full trust document, just a reference sheet. Ruth Holloway survivor. Trust. Equal remainder distribution after surviving spouses. Reserve fund restricted for maintenance and emergency use only. Any encumbrance affecting remainder interests requires notice to both named beneficiaries. Both named beneficiaries, Caroline and me. The collateral memo tied to her store loan had referenced the reserve. My father had not just let me be humiliated. He had moved to cut me out while using my name to support Caroline's debt and trying to keep me too small, too dependent, and too embarrassed to push back. The whole story changed right there. This was not one ugly family dinner. This was a system. When the people who raised you decide your silence is an asset, how long does it take before survival starts looking like resistance? Daniel gave me one name before he left: Teresa Wynn, litigation and contested estates. He said if I were his sister, that was who he would call. Then he stood, paid for his own coffee, and walked out like a man who knew one line of his life had ended. I called Teresa that afternoon. Her office was on the third floor of a brick building above a travel agency. The waiting room had 2 old chairs, a jar of peppermints, and a rubber plant trying its best in bad light. She listened while I laid out the anniversary, the reimbursement, the bank, the transfer I saw in my mother's purse, Daniel's warning, and the trust note. She did not interrupt. When I finished, she asked for every document I had, then asked me one question that mattered more than any other. Do you want peace, or do you want the record corrected? In my family, peace had always meant my silence. I said, the record. From there, everything changed in a practical way. Teresa sent a preservation notice. She told the bank to freeze further activity pending review. She pulled my credit file, checked title records, requested full loan origination materials, and started a timeline with dates, amounts, and names. Action steadied me in a way emotion never had. For the first time in weeks, I slept through one whole night. Then the next emotional spike hit. Teresa called me in after receiving a preliminary packet from Harbor State. Greg had delivered the guarantee forms by hand. A notary stamp on one of the supporting pages had been logged after hours by a part-time employee who later admitted she had not witnessed me sign anything. My father's handwritten notes appeared on a cover sheet about bridging until holiday season. Holiday season. As if my identity had just been another decoration put up for Caroline's storefront. That afternoon, my father left me 3 voicemails in a row. Calm voice, controlled breathing, the sound he used when he wanted to remind me he still considered himself the adult in the room. The last message ended with, "You always make this family look smaller." It was the second time I had heard the line in this story. This time, it did not sound like criticism. It sounded like confession. By the end of that week, Teresa had enough to start pulling the whole structure into daylight. I was still scared. I was still angry. But I was not the daughter nearest the kitchen door anymore. I was the person holding the file. After that, the pressure changed sides. Not all at once. Not in some dramatic movie way. Just slowly. In the steady movement of records, notices, callbacks, and people realizing their assumptions would now have to survive documentation. Teresa sent letters to my parents, Caroline, Greg, Harbor State, and Mercer and Lane, demanding preservation of trust, loan, and property records. Harbor State formally froze new draws on Caroline's line pending fraud review. Daniel's office turned over billing logs showing my father had asked for an anniversary night signing to streamline family administration before fall. Teresa circled streamline in red and said people always reached for tidy words when the underlying facts were ugly. I kept working. That mattered to me. My bookkeeping job at the plumbing supply office was not grand, but it was mine. I entered invoices, reconciled purchase orders, answered calls about back-ordered valves and delivery slips. Sometimes the ordinary rhythm of numbers and due dates was the only thing keeping me from drowning in the strangeness of my own family. Then my mother called from the grocery store. I knew she was at the grocery store because I could hear the metal wheels of a cart and the echo of overhead music. She sounded low and urgent. She said the bank had contacted Caroline and frightened her. She said there had to be some mistake. Then she said, families should settle these things privately before outsiders turned them into something cruel. I stood in the supply room holding a box of carbon paper and stared at the cement floor. I said, "Forging a guarantee is already something cruel." She went quiet. Then she said I was using a harsh word, not a false word. A harsh one. Maybe my mother thought silence made her innocent. I think silence only kept her comfortable. A week later, my father came to my apartment building for the first time in his life. He stood by the mailboxes in his navy windbreaker with a cream envelope in his hand, and a look on his face I had seen at church funerals. The controlled solemnity men wear when they want credit for seriousness. He said we needed to talk like adults. I almost laughed. He said Caroline's business had been under pressure, that everyone had made assumptions, that nothing had been meant as an attack. He said families sometimes used temporary structures to get through difficult seasons. He said my attorney was escalating things beyond reason. I let him finish. Then I asked, "Did you use my name without my permission?" He did not answer directly. Instead, he held out the cream envelope and said it was a check for the anniversary dinner, plus interest, because he was trying to be fair. Fair. Exposure had reached him, so suddenly fairness mattered. I did not take the envelope. I told him reimbursement after discovery was not the same as honesty before it. I also told him future communication should go through Teresa. Nothing more. For a second, he looked at me the way he had looked when I was 15 and refused to apologize to a neighbor for something Caroline had done, confused first, then insulted by the existence of my boundary. Then his eyes moved past me into my apartment. He saw the blue file folder open on my kitchen table. He saw I was not bluffing. That was the first time in my life I watched caution enter my father's face, not remorse. Caution. The proof chain kept growing. Harbor State confirmed Greg had delivered the packet. The part-time notary admitted she had stamped a supporting page as a favor because Greg said the family was handling everything internally. Daniel produced his anniversary night notes under formal request. Among them was one line that made Teresa stop reading for a second and take off her glasses. After kitchen exchange, client directed accelerated adjustment, so Elaine removed from equal side before she starts asking for paper. There it was. Not just favoritism, planning. Not just planning, retaliation. My mother tried one softer move after that. She mailed me my old silver serving spoon from holiday dinners, wrapped in 2 sheets of tissue paper, with a note that said, "Thought this belonged with you." The spoon had belonged to my grandmother first. I stood at my sink holding it under the weak afternoon light and understood exactly what my mother was offering. A sentimental object in place of accountability. Something polished to distract from what was rotten. I put the spoon in a drawer and kept going. For the first time in months, I could breathe in small stretches. Sometimes after work, I sat in my car with the engine off and listened to nothing. No demands, no instructions, no family version of events playing over mine. Nobody had fixed what they did. Nobody had apologized in any way that mattered. But I was no longer trapped inside their story. Then Teresa called me in on a Thursday afternoon. Mercer and Lane had scheduled a formal trust administration meeting tied to the proposed amendment my father still wanted to push forward. The bank dispute, and the question of interim control over the survivor trust reserve. All interested parties had to attend. My father had not backed down. Caroline had not backed down. Image had always mattered to them more than retreat. The meeting was set for the next Wednesday evening at Mercer and Lane. Same town. Same circle. Some of the same relatives from the anniversary dinner would be there, along with anyone whose remainder interest could be affected by the trust. Aunt June, Randall, Daniel Mercer, Teresa, my parents, Caroline and Greg. Me. The room in my head went cold when Teresa told me. She said, "Good. Let them all sit still for it." That night, I pulled the anniversary photo back up on my laptop, the wide shot with my place setting removed. I looked at the empty space until it stopped hurting and started feeling like evidence. 6 days later, Teresa and I arrived at Mercer and Lane 20 minutes early. The conference room had a long walnut table, courthouse prints on the wall, water glasses at every seat, and 3 folders laid at my place. Red, cream, blue. Receipts, loan file, trust documents. Beside them sat a small evidence envelope holding 1 brass house key. My key, recovered through document exchange from my parents' home inventory. Callback, proof, symbol, all at once. Voices started gathering in the hallway outside. Chairs moved. Someone coughed. Then the door handle turned, and the room that had been waiting for weeks finally started to fill. If you knew the truth was 1 folder away from breaking the family's favorite illusion, could you sit there and keep your hands still? Before I tell you how the room finally changed, tell me this. How much damage should parents be allowed to excuse just because they did it under the name of family? The setup alone told me my father had misjudged the evening. He thought it would be technical, narrow, containable. Instead, Mercer and Lane had arranged the conference room like an accounting of everything my family had tried to keep offstage. My father sat halfway down the walnut table in his good gray suit, jaw set too tightly. My mother sat beside him in navy, tissue already folded in her lap. Caroline took the seat nearest her, Greg beside her, both of them pale in that careful way people look when they are still hoping procedure might save them from fact. Aunt June sat across from Caroline, Randall beside her, both with reading glasses out and legal pads open. Daniel Mercer sat near the head of the table, no longer my parents' attorney in this matter, but the witness who had heard enough to stop the performance from staying private. Teresa sat beside me with the blue folder. No one looked at ease. That was the first honest thing about the night. For a few seconds, all I could hear was the hum of the vent and the faint click of my mother's ring against her water glass. The same kind of silence had filled the dining room at the anniversary. But this silence was different. Nobody here was pretending not to notice the tension. Daniel began. He said the purpose of the meeting was to address disputed guarantee documents, proposed amendments affecting trust administration, and records suggesting unauthorized encumbrance of a restricted reserve tied to equal remainder interests. He said the discussion would proceed in sequence by documentation, not by family preference. My father interrupted and said the matter had already been blown out of proportion by outside advice. Daniel did not raise his voice. He only said, "The record will answer that." That changed the room. Beat one was just the room itself. Faces, water glasses, the blue folder under my hand, the brass house key inside the small evidence envelope beside it, my mother staring at the tissue instead of at me, Caroline looking at the courthouse print on the wall like she wanted to step into another photograph and stay there. Then beat two landed. Teresa slid the anniversary receipts to the center of the table. Bakery, flowers, rentals, catering, coffee, earned deposit, my card statements behind them. Total at the bottom in black ink, $4,280. Then she placed a bank transfer sheet on top of the stack. Date, 2 days later. Destination, Caroline Holloway Education Fund. Amount, $4,300. No one spoke, not even Caroline. Aunt June took off her glasses and cleaned them slowly with the hem of her cardigan. Randall looked at my father, then at the transfer sheet, then back down again. My mother said, softly, that the transfer had been for the girls. Teresa said that was not disputed. What was disputed was refusing reimbursement to one daughter while redirecting nearly the same amount to the other under false pretenses, then using that financial exclusion in the same week as leverage to remove access and standing. My father said families shifted money all the time. Daniel said families did many things. The question before the room was which of those things had been authorized and truthful. Then beat three landed. Teresa opened the red folder and laid out the Harbor State Guarantee packet page by page. My name, the false signature, my old address, my parents' landline as emergency contact, the copy of my driver's license, Greg's delivery link, the notary irregularity, the freeze notice, the collateral memo referencing the reserve. My mother made a small sound before any full sentence came out. Greg said he had only dropped off documents he was told were already in order. Caroline said she assumed Dad had handled it properly. My father said it was a temporary family backstop and that nobody had intended long-term harm. He used words like technical and bridge and stress. Not one of them sounded better in that room than they had in his head. The reactions stayed painfully real. My mother kept looking down. Caroline's voice changed twice. Greg tried to push the conversation toward misunderstanding. My father wanted to narrow everything to intent. No one screamed. No one needed to. The facts were doing the loudest work. Then Daniel opened his notes. He stated the date and time of the anniversary night kitchen exchange. He identified himself as present in the hallway with a file for trust revision review. He summarized what he overheard: my reimbursement request, my father's refusal, the demand for my key, my mother's support of clearer boundaries, and the immediate instruction afterward to accelerate adjustment so I could be removed from the equal side before I started asking for paper. The room did not explode. It went colder. Aunt June said very quietly. Ruth would have hated this. Randall stared at my father with a look I had seen once before when someone told him a contractor had stolen from his late brother. Not anger first, recognition. Then Beat 4 changed the meaning of everything. Teresa opened the blue folder. Inside was the original Survivor Trust Amendment my grandmother Ruth had signed years earlier, with 2 witnesses and Daniel's firm seal. It did not give me more, because I was loved more. It gave me a role because my grandmother had watched who handled bills, appointments, medication charts, and repairs after my grandfather died. She had watched who treated family obligations like work and who treated them like stage dressing. The amendment named a successor administrative trustee if the acting family trustee attempted to use the restricted reserve in a way that impaired equal remainder interests through concealment, misrepresentation, or misuse of beneficiary identity. The successor was me, not owner, not heiress, administrator, responsible for correcting the record and protecting equal distribution. My father's whole structure collapsed on something he had trained himself never to respect, my reliability. He turned toward me then, face gray around the mouth, and said, "You always make this family look smaller." It was the 3rd time I had heard it. This time, nobody moved with him. Nobody lowered their eyes for him. Nobody treated the line like wisdom. Daniel said evenly, "Let the record reflect that statement as well." That was the end of my father's authority in the room. Not because I argued louder, not because I delivered some revenge speech. Because dates, receipts, trust language, banking records, and one witness who happened to be listening in the hallway had done what truth does when it is finally allowed to sit at the table. The rest happened in fragments that still feel sharp when I remember them. Caroline cried, but only after Teresa explained the bank would pursue correction and the trust administration would shift immediately pending final review. My mother said she had only wanted peace. Teresa said peace without honesty was just pressure moved onto someone weaker. My father asked to continue the matter privately. I said no. All substantive communication would go through counsel. Then I picked up the brass house key from the evidence envelope, the same key I had placed on the kitchen counter beside my anniversary receipts. I held it for 1 second. Then I slid it back across the table toward my parents. I said I did not need access to a house that had only ever welcomed me when I was useful. Nobody stopped me. I gathered the blue folder, my coat, and my bag. As I stood, I looked once at the table. The water glasses. My mother's crushed tissue. Caroline's lowered face. My father staring at the trust page that had turned his favorite daughter into a beneficiary and his least respected daughter into the person who now had to protect both sides from him. Outside, the evening air felt thin and cold. Traffic moved at the end of the block. My phone stayed dark. No one ran after me. No one tried to fix the angle of the story before I reached my car. I did not yell. I did not stay either. I took the folder, set my bag on the passenger seat, and sat in the quiet for a full minute before turning the key. My parents finally knew what it looked like when I stopped carrying their version of me. And even now, when I think about that anniversary table, the missing place setting, the folded napkin in my mother's hands, and the way the room went silent once the trust papers opened, I still cannot decide what should trouble me more, what they did, or how normal they seemed to think it was.